I am delighted to introduce to you today Dr. Charles Long. He was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and he lived there and eventually volunteered for the U.S. Air Force, after which time he went to the University of Chicago, where he received both his BD and his PhD degrees. At the University of Chicago, he studied with Professor Joachim Wasch, the pioneer in the field of the history of religions. He is a very respected author. He has written or co-edited many books, but two of the most well-known are his first book, titled Alpha, Myths of Creation, and his book, Significations, Signs, the Interpretation of Religion, which is widely recognized as one of the best analyses for how religion and the field of religious studies expands our understanding of culture, politics, and human action. And I know that it is one of the books that some students in religious studies courses are presently studying. So I hope you enjoy the talk today. He is a respected scholar as well. He was a founding member for the American Society for the Study of Religion and the Society for Black Religious Studies. He also served as president of the American Academy of Religion and the Society for the Study of Black Religion, which he co-founded. As a professor of history of religions at Chicago, he collaborated with two other trailblazing scholars to found the international journal History of Religions in 1961. He was also the founding editor of the series in Studies in Religion for the University of North Carolina Press and a senior editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia of Religion. Here's a fun fact about him. Growing up, he was never interested in religion. He never attended church, was never interested in learning more about religion at all. Yet today, he is one of the most respected scholars in the history of religions in the world. He will be speaking today on American dilemmas, religion, race, and democracy, looking at the role that race plays in politics and in the structure of our democracy. Through his work, which spans 50 years, Dr. Long has influenced hundreds, if not thousands, of scholars. In the field of history of religions, he is arguably the preeminent African-American scholar. His intellectual legacy has influenced generations, and his work remains highly influential in religious studies and fields as diverse as history, sociology, anthropology, and African American studies. It is a great honor to have such an influential scholar here at YSU today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Long.
Thank you very much, Professor Mauer. I am very delighted to be here. Before I met you, I was greeted by the members of the Department of Philosophy and Religion, and they were so cordial. They greeted me as if I was an old friend who was coming back, and they were happy to have me. So I appreciate that so much. And now this large audience here is just almost too much. You humble me because you think I have something that's worthwhile enough for you to come and listen to. I may and may not. I want to make one small correction to Professor Mauer's introduction. It wasn't that I never went to church. I went to church quite a bit, almost every Sunday when I was growing up. I never liked to go to church. That's the difference. But I was glad I was forced to go to church because unconsciously I was learning so much, and I didn't know I had learned it until many, many, many years later. And so sometimes parents know what they're doing. I don't normally talk about race, and I was telling the members of the department that this is one of the few occasions that I have done so. And so I want to give you some rationale of why I decided to do this. The title of my lecture this afternoon takes into itself the title of the Magisterial Study of American Race Relations by the distinguished Swedish sociologist and economist Gunnar Myrdal. The title of his work, which was published in 1944, was An American Dilemma, the Negro Problem and Modern Democracy. Several reasons prompted me to include this reference in my title. Obviously, as an African American, I have been made aware of and lived the fact of this dilemma all of my life. There are other personal considerations, however, that have to do with the temporal contextuality of Myrdal's publication. The year 1994 was 1 year before the surrender of the Japanese in World War II, thus bringing an end to the war. Being a rather late arrival in the military participation in the war, I was still in the United States Army Air Forces when this book was published. I encountered the text for the first time in a graduate seminar at the University of Chicago in 1949. Most of my classmates at the university were veterans of the recent war. Our country and its allies had won a great victory over a genuinely evil foe. We had, in the words of Tom Brokaw, fought the good war, and American soldiers had seen the world. They had been stationed in Europe, Australia, New Guinea, Japan, the islands of the Pacific, the Near East, India, etc. During the course of the war, our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had made several announcements regarding the nature of the war and why we were fighting it. One of them was a constant motif of these announcements, and it was woven around the themes of freedom, human rights, and human dignity. Our side had won, but our side had on it European nations who reigned over colonial empires. And in the United States, the ever-present racial and ethnic discrimination continued unabated. Now, however, the United States had become the leader of what, in the language of international propaganda, was called the free world. In spite of the victory of freedom by a citizen army of the military, no one could overlook these hard facts of American life and culture. From this perspective, Myrdal's work might be seen as anticipatory, for in the immediate post-war years, the leader of the free world would be challenged and even ridiculed precisely at this point. What do you mean, you leader of the free world? You country that began in slavery and continued it for 200 years and then still discriminate against your own people. So why do you think we should think you are the free world? It is precisely this issue that is addressed in Myrdal's work. And you will notice that the book is edited or written by Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish scholar, not an American scholar. Because for the most part, American scholars as a group significantly overlook the meaning of this country in terms of its possession of populations other than those of European ancestry. I cited the Myrdal text as a background to an intellectual and academic concern for the issues and problems suggested in the title of this study. To be sure, I and most Americans have been aware, lived through, or consciously denied these issues. Furthermore, I had been intellectually aware of these issues from the work of several African American scholars, Du Bois, Holland Lewis, Carter G. Woodson, E. Franklin Fraser, and a host of others. They were probably the only significant group of scholars who would address the problem of America in relationship to the issue of race. Myrdal's work, however, made American academics aware of this problem, and you could almost say made it safe for them now to talk about it. It is not my intention, however, to deal with the issues as either a political scientist, a sociologist, or theologian. I wish to discuss the issues as a historian of religion. In the most general sense, the historian of religions seeks the most interesting way to pose the question, what is religion? I find this place in the Western Hemisphere, in my country of birth, the nation state of the United States, and a most interesting place to ponder this question. Now, before I get into a discussion of America and religion, let's first deal with that word itself, religion, R-E-L-I-G-I-O-N. This word is of ancient vintage. It is from the Latin, two forms in the Latin, religio and religare. Religio means to undertake a task with seriousness and thoroughness, gravitas, we would say today. Religare is the common word for to bind or to tie, like you tie your shoes, or to bind a family together. Now, suffice to say that neither of these terms refer to what we in English would call God or the gods. Today, if somebody asks you, are you religious? You would say, oh yeah, I believe in God. Oh no, I don't believe in God. Well, you see, Latin, it doesn't have anything to do with God. The Romans had very good words for God. They had a lot of them. Deo, Dei, Deus. They knew what a God was. But they did not use that term when they were talking about what you talk about and refer to religion. Now, what we have to understand that something more to the point, that in the Christian church, for most of the time up to the Reformation, people did not use the word religion to talk about Christianity. More often than not, they used the term the follower of Christ, the way of faith, or the path of Jesus, but hardly ever, maybe never, the word religion. The word religion comes into Western parlance as a way of talking about things of this sort from the disputation that Martin Luther had with John Eck at the Diet of Worms. As most of you know, Luther objected to the Roman Church's collection of indulgences, and that was a big argument. Luther himself was a Roman monk. And so this was an internal fuss within the church. And he was to be put down. And John Eck was the one to do it. The side issue here is that Luther was also a North German. The papacy was a Mediterranean structure, a part of the long meaning of Mediterranean religions and its form in the Christian church. And therefore, Luther represented not only a problem of doctrine for the Roman Catholic Church, he also represented the influx of these northern Germans into the affairs of the church. The church had always maintained that there were two forms where the faith was located. One was inner and one was outer. Both were under the control of the church. The inner form through the form of confession, where one would go to the priest to confess their sins and receive absolution. The outer form through the rituals of the Mass and the other rituals of the church. When Luther was at his wit's end in the debate with Eck, Eck had pretty well beat him up. Luther at the end said, "Here I stand. God help me, I can do no other." Now, where is this "here I stand"? What is the location of the "here I stand"? When Luther uses the term "here I stand," he was using the Latin term conscientia. That is his conscience, the meaning of will and reason altogether. It is this aspect that the Roman Church had said was that specific thing that God grants every human being directly and only for that human being. And so Luther was falling back upon that one thing that only God gave to him. See? Now God gave it to every one of you too, but he was falling back on his. Huh? And that opened the door. Now Luther wasn't the first one to use this or to refer to it in the Roman Church. William of Ockham had written about it. Also Thomas Aquinas. But none of them had made use of it in this way. None of them had taken this as a locus, a place within the self, where one could mount a meaning of the most powerful being in the creation. Now, this was something. Because later, the fact that there was a locus in the person, in the individual, where one might take a stand of power against the power of the church, led to all sorts of things. It led, now Luther did not intend this, poor man. It led to individualism. Luther remained a monk until he got married. But he also didn't want to break with a lot of the rituals of the church. He loved the rituals. The fruition of Luther's notion came with the other part of the Reformation, which is represented more in this country than probably any other aspect, and that's Calvin, Jean Calvin, a Frenchman. Jean Calvin was not a monk. As a matter of fact, Jean Calvin came out of the humanist tradition of Erasmus. And he was a practitioner of the law. And what Calvin did was to continue this scathing understanding of where the locus of power was. He undertook a iconoclastic meaning of the power of God and said that no form of creation had anything to do with the salvation of a human being. As a matter of fact, the salvation of each human being had been decided long before the foundations of the world. Therefore, no work that you can or may do has anything to do with your salvation. Your salvation was based upon the mind of the deity, and the mind of deity did not need your performances of this, that, or the other thing to make itself up. So you were already saved or damned long before you were ever born. This also meant there was no point in you going to mass and having rituals and so forth. There was further no point in you having all these rejoicing hymns and singing songs and making merry and so on, because none of it had anything to do with your salvation. Now, in various forms, the Calvinist doctrine was that form of the modern Christianity that went into the northern part of Europe, into Germany, into the Low Countries, into England, and finally into the Americas. It was this aspect that became the most important. Now that's what I wanted to say about the word religion and how it got here. I now want to turn to another meaning of religion, and this comes from someone who spent their time looking at America. This is a wonderful book which you should read. It was written in the 1830s by a Frenchman, Alexis de Tocqueville. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a book which was published in, I think, first in 1834. It was called Democracy in America. De Tocqueville was a French nobleman who had come through the French Revolution. And he was not a Jacobin, nor did he side with the nobility. He was able to ski through. And he thought that his sympathies were for the revolution, but on the other hand, he always thought that the revolutionary people were crazy. They went too far. They thought they could create the world themselves. You know, they threw away all the names of the months, renamed the months. They did all kind of weird things. And he was saying, no, this is too much. But he had a good idea, and he had some funds. So he and his friend Beaumont decided that let's go and see a place where they have democracy and see how it works. So they got on a boat and they came to the United States because they wanted to see a brand new, spanking new democracy work. How does it work? And you should read that book, because it says all kinds of things that you would be surprised that they knew that back in the 1830s. They tell you all kinds of things that our political scientists never tell you. They tell you why there's going to be corruption in a country like this. They tell you all sorts of things, and you say, how did they know that? Read the book. I think that book ought to be a book that every American should read. It's a good book. It tells you a truth that American scholars hardly ever get close to. And it's written without venom. De Tocqueville, in one of his chapters, he speaks, in book 2, he speaks of the 3 races that occupy the land. Now, I always make something of that because if you read books by American scholars on America, you hardly ever hear them talk about something just simple like that. The three races that occupy the land. And so you begin to say, well, why did that strike? Well, that's why it struck me. Most of the time, any book on American history begins with the Puritans, which is a strange place to begin because even if you're just going to deal with Europeans, the Puritans weren't the first ones here. The Spanish were here before the English, and the first English who came were not the Puritans, they were the ones in the middle colonies. So something's going on here. Why you begin there when we know it began here? Why you know? And then we have the three races that occupy the land. Now hear the language. The three races that occupy the land. All right. So let's say something about that. The very fact, you see, the fact that we don't talk about that you haven't been taught this simple fact over and over again, thereby hangs a tale. And I mean tale in both senses, T-I-A-L and T-A-L-E. The land as geographical space has been the constant ingredient shared by all these three collectivities. Each group possessed a different perception of and practice of the land. For the Aboriginal populations, the land expressed not only their livelihood, but also their identity. As a place for human habitation, it had been given to them by a creator or other divine beings. The original inhabitants of the land, known by another European misconceived misnomer as Indians, had already been in this land for well over 1,000 years before Europeans ever appeared. The land was held in common by the entire group in the culture of the specific Aboriginal society. The land was not possessed as real estate, and thus could not be bought or sold. The Aboriginal populations possessed both tacit and empirical knowledge of the land. Such knowledge was expressed not only in rituals and beliefs, but was also a pervasive aspect of their everyday existence. For the Aboriginal populations, the land performed a mutual orientation. It oriented them to their world, and they in turn served the land through the preservation of the land's orientation in space. Now, that's very important. Right now, people are going back and saying, well, we need to learn how to take care of the land and so forth and so on. And how far are we going to go? I mean, you know, we've already done the plowing and planting of the land, and then we've dug into the land. Now we're getting oil of the land. Now we're going to frack it in the land. How far are you going to go? Whose land is it? What do you owe the land, and what does the land owe you? In other words, the land is not here simply for your taking. And this is what the Aboriginal populations knew long ago. It's not your land. The land belongs to the land, or the land belongs to who made the land. Now, this was a fact known in most parts of the world before the modern period. I was telling Professor Jerrison, when he came to pick me up, how I read similar things about the Germanic tribes before Christianity, they converted to Christianity in the 7th and 8th centuries. A similar kind of understanding. Now, beginning as a series of English colonial settlements dating from the early 17th century, the colonies became independent through a revolution in the latter part of the 18th century, and has since become a nation, and we have since become a nation of immigrants, primarily from Europe. In the middle colonies, primarily Virginia and the Carolinas, through the activities of Richard Hakluyt, whose writings about North America can be described as combining travel literature with real estate promotion, urging investment in charter companies and promoting ventures in Virginia and the Carolinas, the land is portrayed as paradisal. Hakluyt would write these ads because he's trying to get people to invest in some companies to get people to come over here. And he would say all kinds of things about the land because he's trying to sell it to these people to make charter companies. So he presented the land as paradise. The other side of that thing is that the land was also understood by the people in New England as hideous and dangerous, as a hideous and dangerous wilderness, as William Bradford put it. So you have these two contrasting notions of the land by Europeans in the middle colonies and in New England. From the time of Bradford to the present, the wilderness theme has been a feature of American culture, its practices and rhetoric. The wilderness is an example of the New World as both the threatening and sinister on the one hand and fascinating on the other. One of the most influential books on American culture and religion was Perry Miller's Errand into the Wilderness, published in 1956. Miller's book initiated a renaissance in the religious meaning of American culture. Since Aboriginal populations were not a part of the city tradition of the European immigrants, they were identified with wilderness, threatening realities to be avoided or overcome. The European metaphoric languages range from wilderness to virgin to paradise. In spite of the force of this metaphorical language, it is clear that the English settlers in New England and the middle colonies were able to work out an understanding and cooperation with the Aboriginal people here. In other words, if they hadn't worked out some arrangement with them for the first 50 or 75 years, they would have died because they didn't know how to live in this land. So it wasn't the case that they came here and they would, with all their know-how, they get there. No, they were helped. They were helped. They were given hospitality, right? And the people then turned on them and messed them up. Francis Jennings, who instituted a whole new way of looking at Aboriginal populations in New England, Francis Jennings wrote a book in which the title of the book, which is quite refreshing, it was published in 1975, and the title of the book was The Invasion of America, Indians, Colonialism, and the Cant of Conquest. He just puts it right out there, you know. In other words, it wasn't just Europeans came over from Europe, they invaded, you know. Invaded, you know, like Normandy. Jennings' study is important because it reorients our perception on the meaning and nature not only of the Aboriginal populations at the time of the English arrival, but shows in detail the inner structure of their inner relationships over a period of time. It also erases the mild or neutral language of pilgrimage and the search for religious freedom that had defined the American rhetoric of the Massachusetts settlements. Jennings continued in turn to uproot the other American shibboleths of the land as virgin or wilderness. From a metaphorical point of view, the Europeans occupied, Jennings says, a widowed land. A widowed land. As Jennings put it, Europeans explored and invaded, discovered, and inhabited land. Had it been pristine wilderness, it would possibly be so still today, for neither the technology nor social organization of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries had the capacity to maintain of its own resources outpost colonies thousands of miles from home. They did not settle a virgin land. They invaded and displaced a resident population. The scholarship on the colonial period over the last few decades has gone far to emphasize two major factors that had not been to the fore in previous works: the structure and periods of relationships of accommodation and the violence waged by English populations against the original inhabitants of the land. The fact that accommodations were possible did not erase the European imagination of these inhabitants of the land as savages. I'm going to skip that part. In his novel, The Confidence Man, Herman Melville coined the phrase, the metaphysics of Indian hating. It is clear that many observers equate the violence against those of non-European racial groups to the experience of the English of the colonial period. As a matter of fact, Richard Drennan, in his book Face and West, The Metaphysics of Indian Hating and Empire Building, and Ralph Slotton, in a series of studies, has taken up the theme of violence as one of the basic ingredients in the formation of Anglo-American culture. I'm going to skip more now. And now I'm going to talk about that other group. In 1619, a ship arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, with 20 African persons aboard, including men, women, and children. They were sold as indentured servants, but this initial form of limited servitude of Africans opened the door to a full-fledged and total enslavement of millions of Africans imported into the colonies from the continent of Africa. The Africans in America constitute, as I put it, an involuntary presence in the land. Of the three races of people, they are the one group that did not wish to be here and were brought to the country bound and in chains. From the small band of indentured servants, the African slave population grew to approximately 3 million by 1850, most of them enslaved on plantations in the Chesapeake, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Some form of slavery existed in every part of the country, however. We should remember that the largest slave port north of Charleston, South Carolina, and you will be surprised, was Providence, Rhode Island. No person of African descent was or could be a citizen of the United States Republic until after the Civil War. While Europeans coveted the land inhabited by the indigenous peoples and their ability to trap furs for the international market, African bodies were desired and coveted by Europeans. The African bodies themselves became commodities in an international market participated in by all the European maritime nations. The enslaved African body was a major source of agrarian labor through the 18th and most of the 19th century. I'm going to rush on, and I hope we'll have some time for, in the question period, where I can say some more things, because I'm giving this kind of lecture because I think at this juncture of American history, it's time for us to start thinking in new ways about who we are and how we got to be this way. Instead of thinking that simply by going on willy-nilly toward a future, things are going to work themselves out. They are not. I'm probably the oldest person in this room. And they have told me over and over again, it's going to work out in the future. And this is what Americans keep telling themselves, it's going to work out in the future. It may, but I am of the opinion that it's not going to work out in the future until we know and understand our past. And I don't mean some made-up story that satisfies you. I mean the real hard-nosed story of who we are, how we got to be this way. And we have to stop speaking in patriotic shibboleths and start coming to terms with the hard realities of our ancestors and the tradition of these ancestors, however they may be, because we will not get rid of them by ignoring them or denying them. I thank you, and I will be open to questions. Go on. Stand up and ask.
Hi. I was a little concerned because lately I've been studying race and ethnicity in several different passages, sociology and criminal justice. And among my peers, I'm probably the oldest one in my class. And it seems to me that this younger generation has crossed several boundaries as far as that. And they don't look at it as race. They're like kind of bored with the terminology of race. They more look at things in a more cultural aspect. Does that seem feasible to you?
No. I'll put it this way. Just because you make up another name, you can call it anything you want. The problem is, how have things changed when you say culture or when you say race? You can call it Tweedledee, Tweedledum, blah, 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 blah. It's what is the reference of the term you're using? Now, young people are in the habit of thinking that if they call something different, it's different. And I look at it and I say, well, if it's different, you ought to call it different. But if it's not different, don't try to fool me and say it's different. There's an old adage of folks of my generation that says, don't do that and tell me it's raining. You see? Because I know the difference between that and rain. See? So just by changing the name, you don't do that very much. See? So and then there's a lot of this kind of political correctness scholarship. And it's, as Lyndon Johnson said, I don't think it's worth a bucket of warm spit. Yeah? Because I think that the archives don't change. These things are in archives in various parts of the country, and they don't change. And all you have to do is go there, and Library of Congress, University of North Carolina Archive, they're there. The stuff is there. Documents are there. They didn't change. Right.
Dr. Long, you described the Native American attitude towards land, the European attitude towards land. Could you say something about the African American legacy they're taking towards
Yes. I wanted to come to that. I had a lot to say about African Americans. I should have put it a little further. But African Americans worked the land, and in working the land, they were forced to work the land. But even in being forced to work the land, they were coming to terms with a reality in their world which the people who owned them did not. That is, they made in that work, they came to an intimacy between themselves and the land. And that was an intimacy and a meaning of their being with the land that was not present with those who owned them. And therefore they had another kind of fundamental reality which could not be controlled or affected by those people who owned them. They had a meaning that was outside of their relationship to the persons who owned them. And that was their out, see? when you read the old stuff, Deep River, when you read Langston Hughes' Unknown Rivers, when you read those stories and hear those poems and music about the land, it's that land that was worked by them, and out of that reality that was more real than the relationship that the master had over them as an enslaved person. That relationship was more real, deeper than anything that they did. And it was that kind of fortitude that made them strong people even in slavery. So that when Reconstruction came, these people jumped out there and would start creating like everything. But I want to say something else about slavery. Ira Berlin, the historian, says there are two kinds of societies that have slaves. One is a slave is a society with slaves, and the other one he called a slave society. A society with slaves is a society that permits slavery, but slavery is not the exemplary or constituting form of that society. A slave society is a society that not only admits of slavery, but slavery is the exemplary form of the human relationship. And it colors every aspect of that society. The relationship between husband and wife, the relationship between student and teacher, the relationship between employee and employer. It covers everything. And America was such a society. America was such a society because it included slavery in its constituting principle. Now, it did it in a very devious and dishonest manner. And this is why the Boston publisher William Lloyd Garrison said that the Constitution is a compact made with the devil. It wasn't simply because it allowed slavery. It was because of the devious, clever, dangerous way in which it did it. Let me tell you, the framers of the Constitution knew that in 1772, Chancellor Mansfield of the English court had ruled against the legitimacy of slavery in the English colony, in England or its colonies. And that judgment was made in this manner. He said, to enslave a person is such an odious act that unless it is written down in law as a positive meaning, it could never be enforced, regardless of where you got your authority to think you could enforce it. Therefore, this man, Somerset, the slave, must go free. Now, these colonial people knew that. So what happens at the Constitutional Convention? They debated slavery almost every day at the convention. But when they wrote the Constitution, the word slave nor slavery appears in the document. The first time the word slave appears in the United States Constitution is in the 13th Amendment, which was after the Civil War. And all the time we had slavery as legal and constituted, but it is not in the Constitution. Why? Because they said it's property. It is property. The strange species of property. See, that's why Garrison said it is a compact made with the devil, because it is such a devious thing. And it is that deviousness of language in the constituting document of the country that is problematic. It's problematic to this day because it sets the style and tone of all legal reasoning about everything. And so, you see, when the man says that slavery poisons everything, he told you the truth. In flying up here, I sat next to an old gentleman from the olden days. He's the kind of people I'd like to sit next to on airplanes. You know, old golden oldie type people. And he was from this area, and so we were talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers and you know, good old days. And he told me when his father bought a season ticket for the Steelers, $28. $28. Oh, we had a good time. And then, you know, we spent the other time, it was a short flight, but we spent a lot of time excoriating all these big corporations who don't care about the people and sell out and whatever. Oh, we were going. You know, one of those good colors. You're not going to have any opposition. One just tried to tell a better story of the, you know. So we got to the point, and we were just landing. And I was about to tell another big story about the bad people. And he said, no, wait a minute. He said, I got a problem. He said, what I don't understand is why these people let them do it. These people who don't have any money. These people who are not going to make any money. These people who are not a part, why do they allow them to do it? That's what he asked me. Now, that's the problem. Why is it we're in a country now where we have a Congress that will tell you it's their job to go there and do nothing? I'm running so I can go to Washington and do nothing. And I think that's a good reason you ought to vote for me.